Welcome to my channel.
How the wind in Lochdubh did not simply blow it investigated. On this particular Tuesday morning, it was an icy, damp inquisitor sweeping down from the granite heights of the mountains, rattling the sash windows of the police station and searching for any gap in a man's clothing through which it could insert a freezing dagger. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was currently doing his utmost to avoid this meteorological interrogation. He was ensconced in the steamy warmth of the Tommel Castle hotel kitchen, a location he found infinitely preferable to his own drafty police station, especially as the station's telephone had a nasty habit of ringing with demands from headquarters in Strathbane. Hamish was a tall, gangly man whose police uniform always seemed 2 sizes too big, hanging off his lean frame in a way that suggested imminent defenestration. His fiery red hair was currently plastered flat by the woolly hat he had only just removed, and his hazel eyes held a deceptively vacuous, dreamy expression. To the untrained eye, which included almost everyone at headquarters, particularly Detective Chief Inspector Blair, Hamish was a slow-moving, unambitious Highlander, a rustic dimwit, barely capable of writing a parking ticket. This was a carefully cultivated illusion. Hamish was, in fact, as sharp as the wind outside, but he possessed a profound aversion to 2 things: unnecessary exertion and the threat of promotion to a busy city station. Currently, he was exerting himself only enough to lift a mug of coffee compliments of the house, provided he stayed out of the way of the paying guests to his lips. He had been up since 4 in the morning on a nature patrol along the River Anstey. Fruits of that patrol, a magnificent 10-pound salmon that had practically leaped into his arms, were currently wrapped in an oily rag and stashed beneath the passenger seat of his battered police Land Rover. "Another scone, Hamish?" asked Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, a worried little man who always looked as if he had just misplaced a crucial piece of paperwork. "Aye, thanks, Mr. Johnson," Hamish said, his voice a soft Highland burr that sounded like peat smoke set to music. "It's a grand day for carbohydrates, as they say." He didn't know who they were, but it sounded vaguely scientific and justified his greed. He was just buttering the scone with an inch-thick layer when the piece of Lochdubh was shattered. It wasn't just a noise, it was an assault. The high-pitched scream of an engine tuned for the Autobahn. Not a single-track Highland road littered with sheep droppings tore through the damp air. Tires crunched violently on the gravel driveway outside the hotel. Mr. Johnson winced. "That will be Mr. Croft." Hamish paused with the scone halfway to his mouth. "The fella who bought the old boathouse." "The very same. A collector of antiquities, he calls himself. A collector of noise and bother, if you ask me. He's from London." The way Johnson said London suggested it was a suburb of hell itself. The kitchen swing door banged open, admitting a gust of cold air and a man who seemed determined to heat the room with sheer arrogance. Crispin Croft was perhaps 40, dressed in a tailored wax jacket that cost more than Hamish earned in a month, spotless designer jeans, and Italian leather boots entirely unsuitable for the surrounding bogland. She had slicked back dark hair and the kind of restless, aggressive energy that made normal people tired just looking at him. "Johnson," Croft barked, ignoring Hamish entirely. "My usual table. And ensure the coffee is actually hot this time. This godforsaken climate is enough to freeze the marrow." He spun on his heel and marched into the dining room without waiting for a reply. Hamish slowly chewed his scone. "Pleasant chap." "He's a nightmare," Johnson hissed, grabbing a silver coffee pot. "He's upsetting everyone. He's demanding the council widen the road to the boathouse so he can get his lorries down there. Says he's building a glass viewing studio for his collection. Mrs. Wellington at the post office says he shouted at her because the satellite signal for his mobile phone is patchy." "It's the Highlands," Hamish said mildly. "The signals are feared of the mountains." Hamish finished his coffee, sighed, and put his cap back on. Duty, however reluctantly acknowledged, called. He needed to get back to the station before Mrs. Pete at the curry shop noticed his Land Rover and came out to complain about her neighbour's cat again. He strolled out through the dining room, adopting his policeman plod walk. Crispin Croft was seated by the window, glaring at the misty view of the loch as if it were personally insulting him. As Hamish passed, Croft looked up, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the uniform. "Officer," Croft snapped. He had a voice that seemed designed to carry across boardroom tables and squash subordinates. Hamish stopped and swiveled slowly. He let his jaw drop slightly, widening his eyes in a passable imitation of a startled sheep. "Sir, are you the entirety of the law enforcement in this forgotten backwater?" "Aye, sir. Just me and Lugs. Charles. My dog, sir, though he's mostly retired from active duty on account of his nerves." Croft gave a derisive snort. "Typical. I pay a fortune in taxes, and this is what it buys." Listen here, Constable. I have had locals trespassing near my boathouse, gawking, probably looking for something to steal. I want patrols down there. Regular ones. The boathouse was down a rutted track 2 miles out of the village, a desolate spot where the loch water was black and deep. It was famous only for being the place where old Angus MacGregor used to land barrels of illicit whiskey 50 years ago. Trespassing, is it? Hamish scratched his head slowly. Well now, the path by the loch is a public right-of-way, sir. Been there since the time of the Jacobites. I own the land now. Croft slapped his hand on the table, making the cutlery jump. I don't care about ancient rights-of-way for peasants walking their flea-bitten dogs. Keep them away. If I catch anyone on my property, I won't be calling you, I'll be dealing with it myself. Do you understand? Hamish blinked once, very slowly. The village was already simmering with resentment against this flashy outsider who threw his money around like confetti and treated the locals as serfs. Croft was digging a hole for himself, and he seemed intent on using dynamite to do it. Aye, sir. I understand fine, Hamish said, his voice mild, giving away none of the shark intelligence ticking away behind his green eyes. I'll keep an eye out, but the folks here are just curious. We don't get many stylish visitors in Lochdubh. Croft preened slightly at the description, mistaking the sarcasm for deference. Just do your job, Constable, if you can manage to stay awake for it. Hamish touched his cap and shambled out of the hotel into the biting wind. He walked to his Land Rover, the smell of the hidden salmon faintly detectable over the scent of wet heather and diesel. He climbed into the driver's seat, shivering as the cold vinyl met his trousers. He hated Crispin Croft. It wasn't a personal hate, not yet anyway, but a weariness. Men like Croft came to the Highlands expecting it to bend to their will, and when it didn't, they caused wreckage. Hamish started the engine, which coughed reluctantly to life. He had a feeling Mr. Croft was going to ruin more than just the view by the old boathouse. He was going to ruin Hamish's quiet week, and that, Hamish thought grimly as he pulled out onto the road, was a veritable crime in itself. The Land Rover's heater breathed out a scent of scorched dust and old dog hair as Hamish rattled along the waterfront. He glanced toward the passenger floor well, ensuring the poached salmon was well hidden. If Mrs. Kennedy from the village shop spotted it, the news would reach the minister before the fish was even scaled. He was planning a quiet evening. A modest fire, a glass of the special amber liquid he kept for medicinal purposes, and a thick slice of the salmon poached in milk. But the piece of Lochdubh was a fragile thing, usually shattered by the very people paid to protect it, or the people who had too much money to know what to do with it. As he turned the corner toward the police station, he saw Archie McLean standing in the middle of the road, waving his arms like a windmill in a gale. Archie was a fisherman whose face had been cured by salt and whiskey into the texture of an old boot. Hamish! Hamish! Man, you've got to come. It's the Londoner. Archie's voice was a panicked squawk that sent a flock of seagulls spiraling into the grey sky. Hamish slowed the Land Rover to a halt and leaned out the window. Now then, Archie, if Mr. Croft has just lost his internet signal again, it's hardly a matter for the police. It's not the signal, Hamish. It's the man himself. He's in the loch, or at least his bits are. Hamish felt the familiar, leaden weight of a ruined day settle in his stomach. He sighed, looked at the spot where his dinner was hidden, and gestured for Archie to climb in. Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed and extremely low confidence, let out a mournful whimper from the back seat, as if he sensed that his own dinner would also be delayed. They drove in silence back toward the old boathouse. The rain had turned into a fine, stinging haar that blurred the line between the water and the sky. When they reached the rutted track Croft had complained about, Hamish saw the Londoner's silver sports car parked at a rakish angle, its door wide open to the damp air. Down by the water's edge, something large and dark was bobbing in the shallows. Hamish climbed out, his boots sinking into the peat. He didn't rush. In his experience, a dead man was the only type of person who wouldn't complain about a policeman being a few minutes late. He walked down to the shoreline, lugs trailing 10 paces behind, and looking ready to bolt at the first sign of a ghost. Crispin Croft was indeed in the loch, but not in the way one might expect a drowning victim to be. He was wedged firmly inside a massive, antique iron-bound tea chest of the many antiquities he had been so proud of. The chest was floating low in the water, snagged on a cluster of jagged rocks. The sight was both macabre and profoundly ridiculous. Croft's expensive wax jacket was bunched up around his ears, and his slicked back hair had come undone, draped over his face like wet seaweed. Most bizarrely, he was clutching a decorative, gold-plated souvenir bagpipe, the kind sold in cheap shops in Edinburgh. and a single, bright yellow rubber duck was bobbing serenely in the water inside the chest, next to his lifeless chin. Is he dead, Hamish? Archie whispered, peering from behind a gorse bush. Aye, Archie. He's as dead as a Sunday in Ullapool, Hamish muttered. He stepped into the freezing water, the Lochdubh chill soaking through his trousers instantly. He grabbed the edge of the chest and hauled it closer to the shore. Croft's eyes were wide, fixed in an expression of indignant surprise, as if he were about to demand to speak to the manager of death. Hamish didn't touch the body more than necessary. He stood back, his hazel eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. There were no obvious wounds, no blood staining the dark loch water, but there was a faint, bitter scent lingering in the air, barely detectable over the smell of salt and wet wool. He looked at the open car door, then back at the body in the crate. Croft had been a man of immense vanity, a man who looked down on the peasants of the north. To end up stuffed into a packing crate, like a piece of unwanted furniture, surrounded by kitschy tourist tat, was a final, humiliating joke. Go to the hotel, Archie, Hamish said softly, never taking his eyes off the chest. Tell Mr. Johnson to phone the station in Strathbane. Tell them to put me through to DCI Blair. Blair? But hell roar the head off you, Hamish. Aye, he will. Trand, hell bring a fleet of cars and sirens, and men in white suits, who'll tramp over every blade of grass between here and the village. But it has to be done. As Archie scrambled away, Hamish knelt by the water, ignoring the dampness seeping into his knees. He reached out and gently moved the yellow rubber duck. Beneath it, caught in the fold of Croft's designer scarf, was a small torn piece of blue paper. It looked like a fragment of a shipping manifest, or perhaps a receipt. He didn't pick it up. He knew better than to disturb the evidence before the professionals arrived to ruin it. He sat back on his haunches, watching the mist roll across the water. The silence of the Highlands had returned, but it was different now. It was a heavy, expectant silence. Somewhere in the village, someone was likely feeling very relieved, and somewhere in Strathbane, DCI's Blair was probably already reaching for his car keys, ready to bring his own particular brand of loud, arrogant incompetence to Lochdubh. Hamish patted Lugs, who was shivering violently. Well, Lugs, he murmured, it looks like the Londoner got his wish. He's the centre of attention now. But I don't think he's going to like the way the story ends. The sound of a distant siren began to wail, a thin, lonely sound echoing off the mountains, signalling the end of the piece and the beginning of a very long, very cold investigation. The sirens arrived before the blue lights could even pierce the thick, rolling haar. 2 white and blue patrol cars and a black unmarked sedan skidded to a halt on the track above the boathouse, their tires throwing up a spray of mud that further dampened Hamish's already miserable afternoon. Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the lead car like a cork from a shaken bottle of cheap cider. He was a short, thick-set man with a face the color of an overripe tomato and a temperament to match. Behind him trailed Detective Sergeant Anderson, looking weary, and a handful of technicians in white forensic suits who looked entirely out of place against the rugged, unforgiving backdrop of the loch. Macbeth! Blair's roar echoed off the crags, sent several more seagulls into a frenzy, and caused Lugs to crawl entirely underneath the Land Rover. I might have known. A body is found in the most ridiculous circumstances imaginable, and who is standing over it, looking like a startled turnip. The bane of my existence. Hamish stood up slowly, his limbs stiff from the cold. He wiped his muddy hands on his trousers, a gesture that made Blair's eyes bulge. Good day to you, sir? I was just keeping an eye out so the tide didn't take Mr. Croft back out to sea. Mr. Croft, you know him? Blair stomped down the bank, his shiny city shoes sinking into the peat with a squelch that clearly infuriated him. Met him this morning at the hotel, sir. He was a bit energetic, from London. Collected old things. Blair reached the edge of the water and stared into the tea chest. He went momentarily silent, which was usually a sign that his brain was struggling to categorize the absurdity before him. A tea chest? A souvenir bagpipe. And what in the name of God is that yellow thing? It's a rubber duck, sir, Hamish said helpfully, though I don't think it was part of his original collection. I don't need a lecture on bath toys from a man who can barely spell his own name, Blair snapped. He turned to Anderson. Look at this. It's obvious. The man was a flashy southerner. Probably came down here to gloat about his wealth, got into a drunken scuffle with some local poacher, and the tucker decided to make a mockery of him. It's a classic case of rural resentment. But sir, Hamish interjected softly, Mr. Croft didn't strike me as a man who would go for a drunken wander in a packing crate, and the boathouse door was locked from the outside. I checked the handle with my sleeve. Blair turned on him, his finger jabbing at Hamish's chest. You checked the handle. You've probably contaminated the entire scene with your incompetence. Listen to me, Macbeth. This is a Strathbane investigation now. You are to stay out of the way. Go back to your village and see if you can find someone who's parked a bicycle on the pavement. Leave the real police work to the professionals. Aye, sir. Of course, Hamish murmured, looking appropriately chastened. He cast a quick sideways glance at the tea chest as the forensic team began to set up their equipment. The fragment of blue paper was still there, tucked into the scarf. Blair hadn't even looked at the body yet. He was too busy looking for someone to blame. In fact, Blair continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low growl, who was the last person to see him alive? That fisherman who called it in. What's his name? McLean? I bet he was out here poaching. I want him brought in for questioning. It's always the ones who find the body. Archie's is a good man, sir. He's got a weak heart and a terror of the law, Hamish said, knowing that defending Archie would only make Blair more certain of the man's guilt. He's a suspect. Now clear off. Hamish whistled for Lugs, who emerged from under the Land Rover looking like a mobile of wet soot. As Hamish climbed back into the driver's seat, he watched Blair barking orders at the technicians, his face getting redder as the rain began to fall in earnest. Blair was looking for a simple answer: violent local, a robbery, a drunken accident. He was ignoring the bitter scent in the air and the deliberate, theatrical placement of the body. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to make Crispin Croft look like a fool. Hamish turned the Land Rover around, the poached salmon shifting under his seat. He knew better than to argue. If he solved this too quickly, Blair would be humiliated, and a humiliated Blair was a Blair who tried to get Hamish transferred to the Gallowgate in Glasgow, just out of spite. No, he would do what he did best. He would go back to the village, he would listen to the gossip, and he would let the professionals chase their own tails until the real truth began to float to the surface, just like the rubber duck. As he drove away, he caught a glimpse of a black SUV parked on a ridge half a mile away. It didn't belong to the police. As soon as the Land Rover's headlights swept toward it, the SU5 engine started, and it vanished into the mist. Hamish's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The Sassenach collector hadn't just been unpopular, he had been involved in something that required a very specific kind of audience. He decided that instead of going straight to the police station, he might just stop by the Patel's curry shop. If anyone knew about strange lorries or late-night deliveries to the boathouse, it would be Mr. Patel. After all, a man couldn't be expected to solve a murder on an empty stomach. Tires of the Land Rover hummed a lonely tune against the wet tarmac as Hamish climbed the Bree toward the cluster of whitewashed cottages that made up the heart of Lochdubh. The village looked like a sodden watercolor painting, the colors bleeding into one another under the relentless grey sky. Every chimney was puffing out thick, aromatic peat smoke. He pulled up outside Patel's curry shop, the neon sign flickering with a tired, buzzing sound that seemed to mimic the static in Hamish's own brain. He looked down at Lugs, who was currently attempting to merge with the floor mats. Stay there, Lugs, and keep an eye on that fish. If I come back and find a single scale missing, there will be no biscuits for a month, Hamish warned. The dog gave a half-hearted thump of his tail, eyes already closing. Hamish stepped out, the wind catching his oversized jacket and making him look like a large, orange-haired bat before he ducked inside the shop. The transition from the Highland chill to the interior of Patel's was like stepping into a different continent. The air was thick and heavy with the scent of cumin, turmeric, and sizzling onions, a warm, spicy fog that instantly cleared the dampness from Hamish's lungs. Mr. Patel, a man whose cheerfulness was considered slightly suspicious by the grimmer members of the Free Presbyterian Church, was behind the counter, vigorously polishing a copper tureen. Hamish, my friend, you look like something the Loch Ness Monster decided was too stringy to eat, Mr. Patel called out, his white teeth flashing in a wide grin. A bad day on the beat? A long day, Mr. Patel, Hamish sighed, leaning heavily against the counter in a way that suggested he might never move again. The weather is doing its best to turn me into a pillar of salt, and the police work is even less agreeable. Ah, you speak of the excitement by the boathouse. The village is humming like a beehive, Hamish. Mrs. Wellington says the English gentleman has finally met his match in a packing crate. Is it true? Did he really try to mail himself back to London? Hamish tilted his head, his eyes roaming the shelves of spices, as if looking for the meaning of life. Not exactly. He was helped into the crate, I suspect, and he wasn't going anywhere but the bottom of the loch. But you know how gossip grows in these parts. By sunset, they'll be saying he was eaten by a giant squid. Mr. Patel laughed, then lowered his voice, leaning over the counter. He was a strange one, that Mr. Croft. Very demanding. He came in here twice, complained the Vindaloo was not authentic enough, and then tried to pay with a credit card that looked like it was made of solid gold, but it wasn't his money that was the oddest thing. It was the lorries. Hamish's ears perked up, though his expression remained one of vacant exhaustion. Lorries? He mentioned he wanted the road widened for his collections. Exactly, but they weren't usual removal vans, Hamish. They were unmarked, dark blue or black. They came late, very late. I saw them from my window upstairs, 2 or 3 times a week. They would go down that track to the boathouse, stay for an hour, and leave. And they weren't bringing furniture. I saw one of the drivers once, a man with a face like a hatchet and a scar that ran from his ear to his chin. Not the sort of person you'd expect to be delivering delicate teacups and oil paintings. Did you see what they were unloading? Hamish asked, his voice a soft, encouraging murmur. Crates. Big ones. Just like the one you found him in, maybe. Although I couldn't say for sure in the dark. But Croft was always there, shouting, waving his arms, looking over his shoulder. He wasn't a man enjoying a hobby, Hamish. He was a man conducting a business. A nervous business. Hamish nodded slowly. This fit with the theatrical nature of the murder. If Croft was involved in smuggling antiquities, or perhaps something less refined, the tea chest wasn't just a convenient coffin. It was a message, a death of a smuggler, quite literally. The souvenir bagpipe and the rubber duck were the punchlines to a very dark joke. He was a Sassenach with more secrets than sense, Hamish mused. And what about the locals, Mr. Patel? Did anyone seem particularly interested in these late-night deliveries? Mr. Patel hesitated, his rag pausing on the copper. Well, you know how it is. People notice things. Young Geordie, the one who works at the garage, he mentioned the lorries had foreign plates once. Eastern European, he thought. And then there's the matter of the lights. Lights? Out on the water. On the nights the lorries came, there were flashes from the middle of the loch, like signals. I thought it was just poachers at first, but the timing was too perfect. Hamish took a mental note. Signals on the loch suggested a boat was involved, which meant Croft's collection was arriving by sea and being moved by road. Lochdubh was perfectly situated for such a trade, isolated, ignored by the authorities, and possessed of a coastline full of hidden inlets. You're a font of wisdom, Mr. Patel, Hamish said, finally straightening up. I don't suppose you have a small portion of vegetable pakora that's feeling lonely, for the man who keeps our streets safe from parking offenders. Of course. Mr. Patel reached into the heated display. Take them. And Hamish, be careful, those men in the lorries, they didn't look like they'd appreciate a policeman with a keen ear. Hamish took the warm paper bag, the grease already soaking through with a comforting weight. I'm not a policeman with a keen ear, Mr. Patel. I'm just a lazy constable looking for a snack. Nobody fears a man with pakora crumbs on his chin. He stepped back out into the cold rain. He could see the lights of DC Vi, Blair's convoy, returning to the village. Blair would not be looking for unmarked lorries or signals on the loch. He would be looking for a local with a grudge. Hamish climbed into the Land Rover. He saw a figure standing in the shadows of the old kirk. It was Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. She looked very terrified. The mystery was spreading fast. He sighed. Hamish pulled the Land Rover to a halt by the old stone wall of the kirk, the engine giving one final, shuddering cough before falling silent. The pakora in the paper bag on the passenger seat was still warm, emitting a spicy scent that made Lugs whine with a renewed, desperate vigor. But Hamish's attention was fixed on the slender figure standing under the dripping eaves of the lychgate, Priscilla Halberton-Smythe. The daughter of the colonel and the woman who had haunted Hamish's dreams and ruined his peace of mind for more years than he cared to count, was huddled in a beige trench coat that looked far too thin for a Sutherland winter. Her blonde hair was dampened by the hair, and even from 20 yards away, Hamish could see the telltale tightness in her shoulders. She wasn't just cold, she was frightened. She climbed out of the vehicle, the wet wind instantly snatching at his cap and reminding him that his own trousers were still sodden from the loch. "Priscilla?" he called out, his voice soft enough not to startle her but firm enough to carry through the whistle of the gale. She turned quickly, her eyes wide, and for a fleeting second, Hamish saw a flash of pure, unadulterated relief cross her face before she masked it with her usual aristocratic poise. It was a mask he knew well, the shield of the Highland gentry, but today it was cracked at the edges. "Hamish," she said, her voice sounding slightly brittle, like dry parchment. "I heard about what happened down at the old boathouse. The whole village is talking about it already. They say it was grotesque. It wasn't a pretty sight, Priscilla. Mr. Croft was not the sort of man to go quietly into that good night, as the poet says. He went in a tea chest, which I suppose is a form of Highland hospitality he didn't expect. Hamish stepped closer, his hazel eyes searching her face. You look as though you've seen a ghost, or perhaps just a very unwelcome guest. Priscilla sighed, a long, shaky breath that disappeared into the mist. He was at the castle only last night, Hamish. My father invited him for dinner, mostly because the colonel is far too polite for his own good, and Croft had been badgering him about local history for weeks. He was trying to buy the colonel's collection of Highland regimental silver. He was incredibly pushy, almost threatening about it. He kept saying that everything has a price if you're looking at the right market, and that my father was sitting on a gold mine he was too quaint to exploit. Hamish leaned against the cold stone of the gate, ignoring the dankness seeping into his back. Trajan, did the colonel sell? He's usually quite attached to those silver quiches. Of course not. Father nearly threw him out after the second course. But Croft just laughed. He didn't seem offended at all. He told us he had a shipment coming in that would make the colonel's silver look like scrap metal. He was boasting, Hamish. He had this little blue slip of paper he kept tapping against his crystal glass, a receipt, or a manifest of some kind. He called it his passport to the big leagues. He was quite drunk by then, I think, but there was an edge to him, a real darkness. Hamish's mind flashed back to the water's edge, the fragment of blue paper tucked into Croft's designer scarf. It seemed the passport had been punched in a way the Londoner hadn't intended. Did he mention anyone else? Any partners or collectors? Priscilla nodded, her gaze drifting toward the darkened windows of the Lochdubh hotel across the square. There was a man waiting for him in the driveway when he left, a man in a large black SUV. I didn't see his face clearly, but I saw his hands when he rolled down the window to take a light for a cigarette. There was a scar, Hamish, a deep, jagged one that ran across the back of his knuckles. Croft seemed not exactly afraid of him, but certainly subservient. It was a strange dynamic for a man who usually treats everyone like his personal footman. A man with a scar, Hamish mused, the image of Mr. Patel's description of the lorry driver clicking into place like a well-oiled lock. It seems our Mr. Croft was playing a very dangerous game of hide-and-seek with people who don't like being hidden from. There's something else, Priscilla added, stepping closer to him, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. After the news broke this afternoon, I found a note pushed under the castle's side door. It wasn't addressed to me or my father. It just said, "The duck has landed. Pay the piper." Hamish, what does that mean? It sounds like some horrible nursery rhyme code. Hamish thought of the yellow rubber duck bobbing in the tea chest and the gold-plated souvenir bagpipes clutched in the dead man's hands. The killer wasn't just a criminal, they were a satirist. They were mocking Croft's collector persona by surrounding his corpse with the cheapest, most garish versions of Scottish culture. It was a petty human motivespite, mixed with a very specific kind of professional warning. It means, Priscilla, that Mr. Croft was likely stealing from the very people he was supposed to be working for. And in that business, there are no industrial tribunals, just tea chests and lock water. He reached out and gently patted her arm. You should go back to the castle. Lock the doors and tell the colonel to keep his shotgun hand in, not for the police, but for any collectors who might come knocking. I have a feeling DCI Blair is going to be far too busy arresting poor Archie McLean to notice anyone else moving in the shadows. You aren't going to tell Blair about the note? She asked, her eyes searching his. Hamish gave a slow, lazy grin that didn't reach his eyes. If I tell Blair, he'll spend 3 days shouting at the paper for not having a return address. No, I'll just keep it under my hat for now. I find that when you have a secret, it's best to let it sit and simmer, like a good stew. Eventually, the steam tells you exactly what's in the pot. Priscilla looked as though she wanted to say more, perhaps to ask him why he insisted on being so infuriatingly indirect, but she simply nodded and hurried away toward her car. Hamish watched her go, a sharp pang of loneliness hitting him harder than the wind. He was a man who loved his village and his quiet life, but sometimes the weight of what he knew made the Highlands feel very small indeed. He climbed back into the Land Rover, where Lugs greeted him with a reproachful bark. The blue receipt, the scarred man, and the landing of the duck, the pieces were all there, scattered like stones on the shore. He needed to find where they fit before Blair managed to frame a simple fisherman for a crime that had the stench of international smuggling all over it. He put the vehicle into gear, the engine protesting the effort. He wouldn't go to the station yet. He had a sudden, pressing need to visit the local harbour. If there were signals on the loch, there would be a boat, and if there was a boat, there would be someone who had seen more than they were telling. The investigation was moving out of the tea chest and into the deep water. The harbour at Lochdubh was not a place for the faint-hearted on a night like this. The Atlantic was in a foul mood, sending long, oily swells to slap against the pier stones, and the air was so thick with salt spray that one could almost taste the misery of the fish. Hamish parked the Land Rover near the slipway, the headlights cutting through the gloom to illuminate the kirsty Archie McLean's aging trawler. The boat looked as tired as its owner, its paint peeling like sunburned skin, and its rigging sighing in the gale. Hamish sat for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, and watched the way the harbour lights danced on the black water. He knew Archie hadn't killed Crispin Croft. Archie wouldn't kill a fly unless it was a particularly plump one hovering over his dram of whiskey, and even then, he'd likely miss by a wide margin. He stepped out, the pakora bag now a greasy memory, and felt the wind try to steal his trousers. He needed to get to the station. As he approached the square, the scene was one of frantic, misplaced energy. Blair's black sedan was parked crookedly across the pavement, and the station lights were blazing, casting long, accusing shadows across the road. Just as Hamish reached the blue lamp, the door swung open and Archie McLean was led out, his wrists encased in gleaming steel handcuffs that looked absurdly large on his thin, weathered arms. Two of Blair's men from Strathbane were clutching Archie's elbows, as if they were arresting an international blan. Terrorist rather than a man whose primary hobby was complaining about his lumbago and the price of tobacco. "There he is," the village idiot returns. Blair's voice boomed across the square, thick with triumph. He stepped out behind Archie, his face a vibrant shade of magenta, looking like a man who had just won the lottery and intended to spend it all on being insufferable. "Looking for your suspect, Macbeth. Well, don't bother. We've got him. Caught him red-handed, or as red-handed as these slippery types get. I told you it was a local grudge. You just didn't want to see it because you were too busy dreaming of salmon." Hamish stopped, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked at Archie. The old fisherman looked smaller than usual, his eyes darting around with the frantic energy of a trapped rabbit. "Ciao then, sir," Hamish said, his voice a calm, low melody against Blair's brassy shouting. "What's Archie done besides look a bit untidy in public? It's not a crime to be scruffy in Lochdubh, or I would have been in Barley years ago. Don't play the fool with me, you Highland stick insect," Blair snarled, stepping into Hamish's personal space. "We found the motive and the means. We searched McLean's cottage while he was helping us with our inquiries. And what do you think we found hidden in his woodshed? A set of antique silver spoons, identified as part of Croft's missing collection. And better yet, we found a gutting knife at the scene of the crime right there by the tea chest with Archie's initials carved into the bone handle. It's an open and shut case. He killed the Sassenach for the silver, panicked when he realized he couldn't move the body, and tried to make it look like a joke to throw us off. It's textbook." Archie let out a pathetic wail, his voice cracking. "I never saw them spoons. They were planted, Hamish. As for the knife, I lost that months ago down by the pier. I told the DCI, but he won't listen. He says I'm a lying thief who's trying to hide behind his age." "Quiet, you," Blair barked. He turned back to Hamish, a nasty glint in his eye. "While you were mooching curry and flirting with the gentry, we were doing police work, real police work. We'll have him in Strathbane by midnight, and I'll have a confession by breakfast. This is what happens when you let a professional handle a murder, Macbeth. You get results. You should take notes, though I doubt you can find a pencil that fits your hand." Hamish didn't answer immediately. He looked past Blair toward the station door. On a small evidence table just inside the hallway sat the gutting knife in a plastic bag. It was indeed Archie's. Everyone in the village knew that knife. It had a handle made from a deer's shinbone, polished to a yellowed sheen by decades of use. But Hamish noticed something else. Something Blair, in his rush for glory, had completely ignored. "Sir," Hamish said softly, "could I just have a quick look at that knife? For the paperwork, you understand." "The paperwork? You are not even on the case anymore," Blair scoffed, but the prospect of making Hamish feel even more excluded was too tempting. "Fine, look at it. See what a real clue looks like. It's the last time you'll see it before it goes to the forensics lab." Hamish walked into the station, his boots squeaking on the linoleum. He bent over the plastic bag. The knife was caked with dried mud and salt, but the edge was as sharp as a razor. He looked at the handle, specifically at the way the initials AM were carved. Then he looked at the screw-top lid of the tea chest that had been brought in as well, still damp from the loch. He looked at the souvenir bagpipes. A slow, thoughtful expression crossed his face. He remembered Archie in the Land Rover, his hands shaking so much he could barely grip the door handle. He remembered Archie's weak heart and the way the old man had to use both hands just to lift a heavy kettle. "Something wrong, Macbeth?" Blair asked, looming in the doorway. "Realizing your friend is a murderer." "Not exactly, sir," Hamish murmured. "It's just, have you noticed the knot on the souvenir bagpipe, the one that was lashed to Mr. Croft's hand?" Blair rolled his eyes. "What about it? It's a knot. McLean's a fisherman. He ties knots." "Aye, sir. He does. He ties the McLean hitcher left-handed knot, because Archie's been a southpaw since he was a lad in the schoolroom. But the knot on those pipes, and the way the twine was wrapped around that knife handle when you found it, well, that's a right-handed clove hitch, clean as a whistle and tied with a great deal of strength." Hamish straightened up and looked Blair in the eye. "And there's the matter of the lifting, sir. To get a man like Mr. Croft into a tea chest and then maneuver that chest into the loch, well, it would take a man with a back like an ox and hands that don't tremble with the palsy. Archie can't even lift a crate of herring these days without help. He didn't put Croft in that box, sir. He couldn't have. Someone went to a lot of trouble to make sure you found that knife, just like they went to a lot of trouble to make sure the silver was in a shed that doesn't even have a lock on the door." Blair's face went from magenta to a dangerous, mottled purple. "Are you telling me how to do my job? You Highland clown! A knot? You're basing a defense on a knot? The knife has his name on it. The silver is in his shed. That's evidence. Your clove hitch is just more of your mystical nonsense." "Maybe so, sir," Hamish said mildly, stepping back. "But the Procurator Fiscal is a very particular man when it comes to physical evidence. He might wonder why a man who can't hold a spoon would choose to wrestle a Londoner into a packing crate. It seems a bit ambitious for a man with a heart condition." Blair lunged forward, grabbing the evidence bag. "Get out! Get out of my station, Rathbane, and if I find out you've been tampering with the witnesses or the knots, I'll have your badge. Do you hear me? I'll have you directing traffic in the rain in Peterhead." Hamish retreated into the night, the door slamming behind him with a force that rattled the police sign. He stood in the square, watching the taillights of the police cars as they sped away, carrying a terrified Archie toward a cell. The red herring had been swallowed, hook, line and sinker. Blair had his suspect, which meant the real killer was now free to finish whatever business had brought those unmarked lorries to the boathouse in the first place. Hamish whistled for Lugs, who trotted over, his tail tucked. "Well, Lugs," Hamish whispered into the freezing wind. "The circus has left town, but the lions are still loose. I think it's time we found out who really knows how to tie a right-handed clove hitch." He looked toward the darkened harbour. The Kirsty was still there, but there was another boat now, a sleek, modern powerboat tucked away in the shadows of the breakwater. It hadn't been there an hour ago, and the lights on its bridge were off, sitting silent as a predator in the dark. The silence that followed the departure of DC the Blair's convoy was not a peaceful one. It was a heavy, accusing quiet that seemed to leak out of the very stones of the village square. Hamish stood beneath the flickering street lamp, his hands deep in his pockets, watching the red smear of the police taillights vanish into the Har. Luggs sat at his feet, shivering with a rhythmic intensity that suggested the dog was contemplating a career change to a warmer climate. Hamish sighed, the sound lost in the moan of the wind. He knew Blair would spend the night bullying Archie, convinced that a pair of silver spoons and a lost knife were the pillars of a solid case. But Hamish's mind was elsewhere, drifting back to the cold, black water of the loch and the ridiculous, colourful objects that had shared Crispin Croft's final resting place. The rubber duck and the golden bagpipes were too specific to be random. They were a language, and in the Highlands, the most dangerous languages were the ones spoken in whispers between neighbours. He began to walk, not toward his station, but toward the harbour, his boots clicking a lonely rhythm on the wet cobbles. The powerboat he had spotted earlier remained moored in the shadows of the breakwater, its sleek hull a jarring contrast to the barnacle-encrusted fishing vessels of Lochdubh. It was a predator in a pool of weary prey. As he walked, Hamish turned the clues over in his mind like smooth river stones. The duck and the piper. Priscilla had seen a note saying the Juck has landed. Pay the piper. In the village's long and often bloody memory, the piper usually referred to one thing: the price of silence. And ducking was an old, cruel punishment for those who spoke truths the powerful did not want to hear. Croft hadn't been a collector of antiquities for the sake of art. He had been a collector of leverage. He had been buying up the discarded relics of old Highland families, not for their silver content, but for the secrets tucked into the secret compartments of their bureaus and the backs of their family portraits. Hamish reached the edge of the pier and looked down at the powerboat. It was named the Gilded Lily, a name that reeked of the same flashy arrogance Croft had worn like a cloak. Croft was dead, and the boat was still here, which meant the business wasn't finished. He remembered Mr. Johnson, the hotel manager, and how nervous he had been earlier. Johnson had been polishing that copper tureen as if he were trying to rub a hole through time itself. He had been helpful, yes, but with a frantic sort of desperation. Hamish pulled his cap lower against the rain. He needed to find the source of the ducking reference. He steered his steps away from the water and toward the small, cramped cottage of Miss Davina Todd, the retired schoolmistress who served as the unofficial archivist of Lochdubh's many scandals. Her window was a single amber eye in the darkness, and as Hamish knocked, he could hear the frantic scuttle of her many cats. "It's a bit late for a census." Hamish Macbeth, Miss Todd chirped as she opened the door, her face a map of 1,000 ancient grievances. She was wrapped in a tartan shawl that smelled strongly of mothballs and lavender. "I suppose you're here about the Londoner. A terrible business, though I can't say the village will miss the noise of that car." It sounded like a chainsaw with an identity crisis. "I'm looking for a story, Davina," Hamish said, stepping into the warmth of her parlour. "A story about a piper and a duck. Does it ring any bells in that formidable head of yours?" Miss Todd's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. "The piper's debt. That's an old one, Hamish. It goes back to the grandfathers of the men sitting in the hotel bar right now. It concerns the Macrae family, not the ones from the Glen, but the ones who owned the hotel before the current lot. There was a scandal, a hidden affair that resulted in a child being sent away. Story goes that the piper was the man who took the child, and the duck was the nickname of the girl who told the secret, and was subsequently driven out of the village. It's a petty bit of history, full of shame and social embarrassment. But in Lochdubh, shame is the only currency that never devalues." Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. And who would care about that story now? "The Macraes are long gone, are they?" Miss Todd smiled thinly. "The bloodlines in this village are like the roots of the heather, Hamish. You think you've pulled them up, but they're just waiting for the rain. Mr. Johnson at the hotel, for instance, he's a Macrae on his mother's side. He spent 20 years building a reputation as a respectable, quiet man. If it came out that his lineage was built on a foundation of abandonment and theft, specifically the theft of the original hotel deeds, from a dying man, he would not just lose his job, he would lose his soul. He's a man who lives for the respect of the Kirk." The pieces shifted and locked. Croft hadn't been smuggling Eastern European treasures. He had found the original, stolen deeds in an old tea chest he had bought at an estate sale. The smuggling lorries were likely just moving his vast, disorganized purchases. Croft had realized the value of the deeds not as history, but as a weapon. He was blackmailing Johnson, the man who prided himself on being the invisible, helpful heart of the village. The murder wasn't about international crime, it was about a terrified little man trying to keep his secret buried in the silt of the loch. Johnson's bitter signature, a final act of defiance against the duck who had once ruined his family, and the bagpipes were the payment to the piper he could no longer afford to satisfy. Hamish thanked Miss Todd and stepped back into the night. He saw the black SUV from earlier parked at the end of the lane, its engine idling. The man with the scarred hand was not a partner. He was likely a private bailiff Croft had hired to ensure his collections were secured. But Johnson wouldn't mow that. Johnson would be paralyzed by the fear of exposure. Hamish realized the motive was as old as the mountains, the desperate need to remain respectable in a place where everyone knew your business. He looked toward the hotel, the grand building that Johnson loved more than any person. The trap was almost ready to be set, but Hamish needed to be careful. He wasn't dealing with a mastermind, he was dealing with a cornered rat who had already proven he was capable of a theatrical, desperate violence. He needed to make Johnson believe that the secret was still safe, even as the water began to rise around him. Hamish whistled for lugs, his mind already weaving the rumor that would bring the killer out of the shadows. He would spread the word that a second tea chest had been found, one that contained the very papers Croft had used to pay the piper. In Lochdubh, a well-placed lie was often the only way to catch a truth. The night had grown even more treacherous, the hearth thickening into a cold, wet blanket that muffled the sound of the sea and turned the lights of Lochdubh into ghostly, indistinct smudges. Hamish Macbeth did not return to his station. Instead, he made his way back to the Lochdubh Hotel, his walk a slow, heavy-footed trudge that suggested a man defeated by a long day of police work. Inside the hotel bar, the atmosphere was as taut as a violin string. The usual hum of evening chatter had been replaced by a low, uneasy murmur. Every eye turned toward Hamish as he pushed through the heavy oak doors, his uniform damp and his expression one of vacant, blinking exhaustion. Behind the bar, Mr. Johnson was a study in controlled anxiety. His knuckles were white as he gripped a polishing cloth, and the faint, nervous tick beneath his left eye had become a frantic pulse. He looked like a man who had successfully navigated a shipwreck, only to realize the shore was made of quicksand. "Is it true then, Hamish?" asked Willie Lamont, the local butcher, his voice booming in the quiet room. "Has that man Blair really hauled poor Archie off to the cells for the murder of the Londoner? It's a disgrace, so it is. Archie wouldn't harm a fly unless it was stealing his bait." Hamish slumped onto a stool at the far end of the bar, nearest to where Johnson was standing. He sighed, a long whistling sound that seemed to leak out of his very boots. "Aye, Willie, the DCI is quite convinced. He's got the silver, he's got the knife, and he's got a heart full of ambition. He says the case is closed, and he'll be looking for a promotion by the weekend." Hamish turned his hazel eyes toward Johnson, his gaze appearing misty and unfocused. "It's a grand thing, is it not, Mr. Johnson, to have the world all tidied up and put into boxes? Though I must admit, my own mind is a bit of a muddle. I suppose that's why I'm just a village constable and not a great detective from the city." Johnson forced a thin, mirthless smile. "It must be a relief for the village, Hamish, to know the killer is behind bars. We can all sleep a little sounder tonight, I imagine." "Oh, I'm sure," Hamish murmured, leaning closer as if sharing a confidence. He looked around to ensure the other patrons were occupied with their own drams. "Though between you and me, Mr. Johnson, I think the DCI was in such a hurry to catch his fish that he didn't notice the hole in his net. You see, while Blair was busy shouting at Archie's woodshed, I went back down to the reeds. I had a feeling, you see, a silly Highland feeling that something was missing, and I was right." The polishing cloth in Johnson's hand stopped moving. The silence between the two men became a physical weight. "Oh, and what did you find in the reeds, Hamish? More of those ridiculous souvenir toys?" "No, not toys this time," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that nevertheless carried clearly to the man behind the bar. "It was a small metal box, Mr. Johnson, taped beneath the floorboards of the old pier, right where the water hits the pilings. It must have belonged to Mr. Croft. It was locked tight, and the seal was waterproof. I couldn't get it open with my pocket knife, and I didn't want to break it and ruin whatever was inside. It looked like, well, it looked like legal papers, old ones. I could see the wax seal through the little glass window on the lid." Johnson's face went a shade of grey that matched the mist outside. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing convulsively. "And where is this box now? Surely you gave it to the DCI before he left for Strathbane." Hamish let out a self-deprecating chuckle and shook his head. "And have him roar at me for tampering again? Oh, thank you. I'm not that much of a fool. I have hidden it, Mr. Johnson. I tucked it away in a hollowed-out peat stack just behind the boathouse. I figured I'd let the DCI cool his heels in the city for a few hours, and then I'll go and retrieve it in the middle of the night when the tide is at its lowest. That will be around 2 in the morning. I'll take it straight to the Procurator Fiscal myself tomorrow. If those papers prove Archie is innocent, or if they show that someone else had a reason to want Mr. Croft in that tea chest well, then I'll have done my job without getting my head bitten off by a man with a red face." 2 in the morning, Johnson repeated, his voice barely a breath. "That's a long time to wait, Hamish. Is it not dangerous to leave evidence just lying in a peat stack? What if someone finds it? In this weather?" Hamish stood up, stretching his long limbs until his joints popped. "Nobody in their right mind will be out at the boathouse tonight. The wind is enough to skin a cat. No, it's safe enough. I'm going back to the station now to have a bit of a nap and a pot of coffee. I'll need my strength for the walk down the track later. My Land Rover is nearly out of petrol, and the pump is locked until morning, so I'll be going on foot." He tapped his cap and began to move toward the door, lugs trailing behind him. "Good night to you, Mr. Johnson, and don't you worry. By dawn, the real truth will be out, and we can all go back to being a quiet, respectable village again." As the door clicked shut behind him, Hamish didn't head for the station. He stepped into the shadows of the alleyway and waited. Through the window of the bar, he saw Johnson move with a sudden, frantic speed. The manager didn't even stop to finish the glasses. He spoke a few hurried words to the barmaid, grabbed his heavy coat from the hook, and vanished out the back entrance. Hamish's lazy expression vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp alertness. He knew the psychology of a man like Johnson. The manager wouldn't be able to resist. The fear of those deeds, those legal papers that could strip away his borrowed respectability, would act like a hook in his jaw. Hamish began to walk, but not toward the boathouse track. He took the high path, the one that skirted the ridge overlooking the loch. It was a treacherous climb in the dark, but it would give him a clear view of the boathouse without being seen. He reached the vantage point just as the moon made a brief pale appearance through a rift in the clouds. Below him, he saw the flickering beam of a torch, moving erratically down the track toward the water. It was Johnson. The man was running, stumbling over the ruts, his desperation evident even from a distance. Hamish settled into the heather, the cold mud soaking into his knees. He didn't have a box, and he didn't have a diary. All he had was a trap built of words, and a killer who was about to walk right into it. He watched as Johnson reached the peat stacks and began to tear them apart with his bare hands, the respectable manager reduced to a panicked animal. The piper was about to be paid, but not in the currency Johnson expected. Hamish checked his watch. The tide was turning, and the final act of the Lochdubh mystery was about to begin in the freezing dark. The cold was a physical weight now, pressing down on Hamish's shoulders as he watched the scene below. Johnson, the man who prided himself on the perfect crease in his trousers and the punctual delivery of afternoon tea, was on his knees. He was clawing at the dark, damp blocks of peat as if he were trying to unearth his own soul. His breathing was audible even over the moan of the wind, a series of ragged, desperate gasps that spoke of a mind pushed beyond its breaking point. Hamish stood up slowly, the movement sending a protest through his limbs. He began the descent with the silent, sure-footed grace of a Highland poacher. Lugs followed, tail tucked, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The mooching constable was gone, replaced by something older and more dangerous. "It's a long way down from the hotel, Mr. Johnson," Hamish said, his voice cutting through the wind like a whetted blade. Johnson let out a strangled shriek and spun around. His face, illuminated by the torch, was unrecognizable. It was smeared with black mud and contorted by a terror so profound it looked like a physical deformity. In his right hand, he clutched a rusted spade from the shed. "Hamish," Johnson gasped, his eyes darting wildly. You frightened me. I was just checking. You said there was a box. I didn't want the thieves to get it." "The only thief here, Mr. Johnson, is the one who stole a man's life because he was afraid of an old piece of paper," Hamish said, stopping. "He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. There is no box. There are no deeds in the peat. There is only a man who couldn't bear the thought of the village knowing his family started with a lie." Johnson's grip on the spade tightened. "You don't understand. Croft, he was a devil. He found them in a bureau he bought at the Macrae estate. He called me into his office. He laughed at me. He said he was going to turn the hotel into a heritage centre and expose every dirty secret the Macraes ever had unless I paid him. He didn't even want money, Hamish. He wanted to own me. He wanted me to be his servant, his little Highland pet. He was going to take everything. So you invited him to the boathouse," Hamish mused, his voice almost sympathetic. "You told him you had more antiquities to show him. You knew about his love for the theatrical. You hit him, didn't you? One clean blow when his back was turned. Then you stuffed him into the very chest he had used to threaten you. The duck and the pipes. Those were your little jokes, weren't they? A way to vent 20 years of suppressed Highland rage against the man who thought we were all just caricatures in a gift shop. He deserved it," Johnson screamed, echoing off the water. "He was a Sassenach parasite. And Archie, everyone would have believed it was Archie. He's a drunk, a poacher." "It was perfect. Archie is a friend," Hamish said. And for the first time, a flicker of genuine anger touched his eyes. "And you tried to hang a murder on him to save your precious reputation. That's the real crime, Mr. Johnson. Not the killing of a man like Croft, but the willingness to destroy an innocent soul to keep your waistcoat clean." Johnson lunged then. It wasn't the calculated attack of a fighter, but the clumsy, suicidal rush of a cornered animal. He swung the spade in a wide, whistling arc. Hamish didn't flinch. He stepped inside the swing, his movements fluid and deceptively fast. He caught Johnson's wrist with one hand and used the man's own momentum to spin him toward the wet peat stack. Sharp, practiced twist. Hamish forced the spade from Johnson's fingers and pinned the manager against the cold earth. "Enough," Hamish barked. The authority in his voice was absolute, a stark departure from the morning. "It's over, man. The har is lifting, and the truth is out. There's no more hiding behind the tea urn." Johnson collapsed, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had arrived. He began to weep for Croft, and not for Archie. but for himself. He wept for the loss of his standing and his respectable life. Hamish reached into his pocket and produced a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. He clicked them into place around Johnson's muddy wrists, the sound sharp and final in the Highland silence. "You'll come with me now," Hamish said, helping the broken man to his feet. "We'll walk back to the village. The Land Rover's petrol may be low, but my legs are sturdy." As they began the long, miserable trudge back toward Lochdubh, Hamish looked out over the loch. The moon was higher now, casting a silver path across the water where Crispin Croft had met his end. The mystery was solved, but there was no joy in it. A man was dead, another was ruined, and the peace of the village had been stained by a very old, very petty kind of darkness. Lugs trotted ahead, his tail finally up, sensing that the danger had passed. Hamish thought of the salmon under his seat, the salt-crusted window of his kitchen, and the quiet fire he had promised himself. He had the killer, but he also had a problem that required a more delicate solution than a pair of handcuffs. If he looked too clever, Blair would ensure Hamish was transferred to the city before the week was out. Hamish glanced at the sobbing man beside him, whose dignity was now as tattered as his coat. "Turn to me, Mr. Johnson," he said, his voice returning to its soft, deceptive burr. "I don't want any credit for this. You'd give him the credit?" "I want my peace, man," Hamish said, smiling slightly. The walk back to the village was a slow, haunting procession of two men and a dog against the backdrop of a dying storm. Mr. Johnson, once the pillar of Lochdubh's hospitality, now looked like a ghost that had been dragged through a soot pit. His sobbing had subsided into a series of rhythmic, hollow hiccups, and his shoulders were hunched so far forward he seemed to be trying to fold himself into the damp heather. Hamish kept a firm but not unkind grip on the man's elbow, his own mind already working several moves ahead. The capture was the easy part, the disposal of the glory was the real challenge. Hamish knew that if he marched into the station and laid out the forensic brilliance of the right-handed clove hitch and the historical motive of the Macrae deeds, he would be a hero. He would be on the front page of the Strathbane Gazette, and within a month, he would be sitting in a cramped, windowless office in Glasgow, breathing in exhaust fumes and staring at a computer screen instead of the shifting colours of the loch. That was a fate far worse than any wind chill or peat bog. "Listen to me, Mr. Johnson," Hamish said, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur that seemed to calm the shaking man. "You've done a terrible thing, but I have no wish to see a man's family name dragged through the mud more than necessary. When we get to the station, DC Vice Blair will be there, or hell be on his way. He's a man who likes to believe he's the smartest person in the room. If you tell him that his brilliant interrogation of you at the hotel, the way he looked at you with those piercing eyes, made your conscience snap, he'll be very pleased. Tell him that his insight into the psychology of the local made you realize you couldn't hide from his genius. Do you understand? You confess to him, and you let him believe it was his pressure that broke you." Johnson looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and confused. "But it was you, Hamish. You found me. You knew about the duck." "I'm just a simple constable who likes his tea and his peace," Hamish replied with a faint, deceptive smile. "In the eyes of the law, I was just following the DCI's inspired lead. If you give him the credit, he'll be so busy preening himself for the cameras that he might forget to be quite so vengeful during the trial. It's your only chance for a bit of leniency, man. Give the big man his victory." They reached the outskirts of the village, just as the first grey light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky. The village square was still littered with the remnants of the previous day's chaos, but a fresh police cruiser was already parked outside the station. DC Vice Blair was there, pacing the pavement with a cup of lukewarm coffee, and a face that suggested he had spent the night chewing on wasps. When he saw Hamish approaching with a handcuffed, mud-caked Johnson in tow, his jaw dropped so far that a bit of coffee sloshed onto his tie. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, though there was a note of genuine shock beneath the anger. "What is this? Why have you got the hotel manager in irons? I told you to stay out of the way." Hamish stopped and adopted his most vacant, apologetic expression. He shuffled his feet and touched the brim of his cap. "I'm sorry, sir. I know I was told to stay put, but I couldn't stop thinking about what you said back at the station. About how the killer was someone close to the heart of the village. Your words, sir, they kept rattling around in my head like a pebble in a tin. I went for a walk to clear my mind, following that logic of yours, and I stumbled upon Mr. Johnson down by the boathouse. He was quite overcome by the brilliance of your earlier questioning. He told me he couldn't live with the guilt once he realized you were onto him." Blair blinked, his chest beginning to puff out like a territorial pigeon. He said that. he said. My questioning broke him. Aye, sir. He was quite specific about it, Hamish lied smoothly, glancing at Johnson. The manager, sensing his cue, gave a miserable, defeated nod. He says your eyes were like gimlets, sir. He knew it was only a matter of time before you came back for him with the real evidence. Blair's face transformed from a mottled purple to a radiant, self-satisfied glow. He stepped forward, grabbing Johnson by the arm and practically shoving Hamish aside. I knew it. I knew there was something shifty about him when he served the soup. It's all about the instinct, Macbeth. Something you'll never understand in your little rustic bubble. Anderson, get the tape recorder. The suspect is ready to make a full confession based on my primary investigation. As Blair marched his prize into the station, he paused at the door and looked back at Hamish with a condescending sneer. And you, Macbeth. I suppose I should mention in my report that you were present for the arrest. Though try to clean yourself up, you look like you've been living in a ditch. It's an embarrassment to the uniform. Aye, sir. Sorry, sir, Hamish murmured, looking appropriately humbled. Within the hour, Archie McLean was released from the holding cell. The old fisherman emerged into the morning light looking dazed and fragile, clutching his worn cap in his hands. He saw Hamish leaning against the Land Rover and hobbled over, his eyes filling with tears. He let me go, Hamish. Blair said he had found the real culprit through superior detective methodology. He said I was lucky he was such a thorough man. You're a free man, Archie, Hamish said, patting the man's thin shoulder. Go on home. I'll be by later with a bit of salmon for your supper. I think we both need a quiet day. As the police cars began to depart, carrying the hero of the hour back to Strathbane to claim his glory, the silence of Lochdubh began to heal itself. The mist was gone, replaced by a crisp, cold morning that turned the loch into a sheet of polished glass. Hamish watched the last of the sirens fade into the distance, a sense of profound relief washing over him. He was still just a village constable. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a detective inspector. And most importantly, he wasn't being transferred. He was home. He climbed into the Land Rover, whistled for lugs, and felt the weight of the poached salmon beneath the seat. The death of a smuggler would be a front-page story for Blair, but for Hamish, it was just another long night in the Highlands. He turned the key, the engine groaning to life, and headed toward the small, quiet cottage that held his stove, his coffee, and his peace. The Land Rover's engine gave a final, satisfied growl as Hamish pulled into the small gravel patch outside his police station come home. Ciao. The morning sky had finally shed its coat of leaden grey, revealing a pale, watery blue that reflected off the puddles with a brilliance that made him squint. Lochdubh was waking up, but it was a quiet, subdued awakening, like a person recovering from a particularly vivid and unpleasant fever. As he stepped out of the vehicle, the air felt different, cleaner, as if the departure of Crispin Croft and the theatrical violence of his end had been washed away by the tide. He reached under the passenger seat and retrieved the oily rag containing the 10-pound salmon. It was cold and firm, a tangible reward for a night spent in the company of ghosts and blackmailers. Lugs trotted ahead to the door, his tail a rhythmic metronome of canine relief. The dog knew the routine. The danger had passed. The sirens had faded into the hills of Strathbane. And the only thing remaining on the agenda was the restorative power of a warm kitchen and a very long, very deep sleep. Hamish entered the cottage and was immediately greeted by the familiar, lingering scent of peat smoke and old wool. It was a cold house, a bachelor's house, but to Hamish, it was a sanctuary. He went straight to the black iron stove, the heart of his small world, and began the ritual of coaxing it back to life. He crumpled up yesterday's edition of the Strathbane Gazette, the one with crossword head "Never Finished," and layered it with dry kindling and a few choice lumps of peat. As the first orange flames began to lick at the chimney, he felt the tension in his neck finally start to dissolve. He moved to the sink, unwrapped the salmon, and began to clean it with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent his youth on the riverbanks. Chess was magnificent, its silver scales catching the morning light, a silent testament to the Highlands' enduring bounty. He placed it in a large poaching tin, covered it with milk, a knob of butter, and a sprinkle of herbs he had grown in a cracked pot on the windowsill. As the stove began to radiate a gentle, encompassing warmth, Hamish sat at his small wooden table and stared out the window at the loch. In his mind's eye, he could still see the yellow rubber duck bobbing in the dark water. It had been a petty thing, a joke born of a deep-seated Highland grudge, yet it had led to the ruin of a man who had spent 20 years trying to be respectable. Johnson had been a fool, but Hamish couldn't help but feel a flicker of weary pity for him. The manager had allowed the Sassenach collector to get under his skin, to poke at the old wounds of family shame until the blood ran. Croft had been a catalyst, a man who didn't understand that in a place like Lochdubh, history wasn't something you bought and sold, it was something you lived with every day, like the damp in the walls. Croft had tried to own the village's secrets, forgetting that secrets in the Highlands have a way of biting the hand that holds them. The telephone on the wall began to jangle, a shrill, demanding sound that shattered the morning peace. Hamish didn't move. He knew who it would be. It would be DCI Blair, likely calling from the station in Strathbane, surrounded by microphones and flashbulbs. Blair would be roaring about the meticulous investigation and the brilliant apprehension of the suspect. She would be taking the credit for every insight Hamish had quietly fed him, and he would be expecting his subordinate to be at the station, ready to file the mountains of paperwork that Blair himself was too busy to touch. Hamish watched the phone as it rang and rang, its bell a frantic plea for attention. He reached out, his hand hovering over the receiver, and then he slowly, deliberately, lifted it an inch and set it back down on the cradle. The silence that followed was exquisite. He wasn't going to Strathbane today. He wasn't going to stand in the background of a press conference while Blair preened for the cameras. He was going to stay right here, in his oversized uniform, in his drafty cottage, and he was going to be exactly what the world thought he was, a lazy, unambitious village constable who was lucky to have found a suspect while out for a stroll. It was a comfortable mask, one that protected him from the cold winds of the city and the even colder winds of professional ambition. If the world thought he was a fool, let them. A fool got to eat poached salmon in the sunshine, while a hero had to sit in meetings and worry about his pension. He began to whistle a low, mournful Highland air as the smell of the cooking fish started to fill the room, a scent that promised comfort and a return to the ordinary. Lugs had already claimed his spot on the rug before the stove, his eyes half closed in a state of blissful ignorance. Hamish leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He thought of Priscilla and the look of relief on her face when he had told her to lock the doors. He thought of Archie McLean, probably now tucked into his own bed, dreaming of a sea that didn't contain packing crates or silver spoons. Death of a smuggler would be a footnote in the history of Lochdubh, a tale to be told over drams in the hotel bar once the memory of the real horror had faded into gossip. The village was safe again, purged of the outsider's noise and the manager's hidden shame. It was a small victory, one not through forensics or force, but through a bit of listening and a well-placed lie. Hamish Macbeth, the smartest man in the Highlands, sighed with contentment, adjusted his woolly hat, and prepared to drift off into the kind of sleep that only the truly lazy can ever really enjoy. The loch remained still, the mountains remained indifferent, and in the small police station, the stove burned bright and steady, a lone beacon of quiet, deceptive peace in a world that insisted on being much too loud. He was home, he was stay at home, and for Police Constable Hamish Macbeth, that was the greatest mystery of all. He reached out to Pat Lugs, feeling the warmth of the dog's fur, and whispered a single word of thanks to the Highlands for keeping him exactly where he belonged. The kettle began to hiss on the stove, a gentle, domestic sound that heralded the start of a perfect, work-free afternoon. Everything was back to normal, and in Lochdubh, normal was more than enough. He was a simple man with a simple life, and as long as he kept his secrets as well as the mountains kept theirs, he would never have to leave the home he loved. EPILOGUEQ. The smell of the poaching salmon was now thick and heavenly in the small kitchen, a rich, creamy aroma that seemed to coat the very walls of the cottage like a layer of culinary silk. Hamish Macbeth stood by the stove, a wooden spoon clutched in his hand, his eyes glazed with the sort of profound, vacant contentment that DC First Blair would have mistaken for a total lack of neurological activity. To Blair, a successful case was a trophy to be mounted on a wall of career achievements, a stepping stone toward a larger desk, a flashier car, and the hollow respect of men in expensive suits. To Hamish, success was measured in more tangible Highland currencies, the silence of a telephone that had finally stopped its frantic screaming, the steady crackle of peat in the hearth, and the knowledge that he wouldn't have to pack his belongings into a cardboard box and move to a city where the sky was the color of a wet sidewalk. He had navigated the treacherous, freezing waters of a murder investigation, avoided a promotion that would have been a death sentence for his soul, and ensured that an innocent man was back in his own bed. It was, by any reasonable standard of the Sutherland Constabulary, a grand day's work. A sharp, distinctive rap at the door broke through the gentle sizzling of the butter. Hamish didn't need to check the window. The scent of expensive perfume or something floral, sophisticated, and decidedly French was already drifting through the gaps in the doorframe, battling the aroma of the salmon for dominance. It was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. He sighed, a sound of weary pleasure, and straightened his somewhat crumpled uniform shirt before opening the door. Priscilla stood on the threshold, looking radiant in a dark green velvet coat that made her blonde hair shine like spun gold against the grey, receding mist of the morning. Her expression was a familiar mix of aristocratic amusement and genuine, if slightly exasperated, concern. "Hamish," she said, her voice a cool, melodic contrast to the whistling wind. "The village is in an absolute state. Mrs. Wellington is currently holding court at the post office, claiming you caught the killer red-handed in a bog after a desperate hand-to-hand struggle. Meanwhile, the radio from Strathbane is broadcasting a statement from DC Firs, Blair about a revolutionary psychological profile that led him directly to the culprit. My father is utterly confused. The minister is already drafting a sermon on the perils of antique tea chests, and Archie McLean is at the harbour telling anyone with a pair of ears that you are a saint in a police uniform who can see through solid stone." "Come in, Priscilla," Hamish said, stepping back to let her into the warmth. "Archie has a tendency to embellish the truth when he's had a scare, and a night in the cells is enough to make any man see saints in every shadow. As for the DCI, he is a man of remarkable vision. He has a way of seeing into the dark, twisted corners of the human soul that a simple village constable like me could never hope to emulate. If he says it was his psychology that did the trick, then who am I to argue with the professional elite?" Priscilla stepped into the kitchen, her nose wrinkling slightly at the heavy scent of fish and peat smoke. She sat at the small, scarred wooden table, looking entirely out of place in her finery. "You're doing it again, Hamish. You're hiding in plain sight. You've handed that man a victory on a silver platter, just so you can stay here and poach salmon in your slippers. It's infuriating. You have a brilliant mind, you saw what everyone else missed, and you waste it on a village where the most exciting event of the month is a sheep getting its head stuck in a fence. Gee. It's not a waste if I'm happy, Priscilla," Hamish replied mildly, his hazel eyes settling on her with a deceptive softness. "Lochdubh has its own rhythm, its own particular brand of peace. If I were a detective in the city, I would be dealing with people who kill for power or politics. Here, I deal with the wind, the rain, and the occasional secret that stayed buried just a little too long. I think I prefer the secrets. They have more character, and they generally don't require me to wear a tie." Priscilla's gaze drifted to a small, charred scrap of blue paper resting in the glass ashtray by the stove. It was the remains of the manifest, the real evidence that could have linked the hotel deeds to the theft. Hamish had watched it curl and blacken in the flames an hour ago. "What about the papers, Hamish? The ones Croft used to ruin Mr. Johnson's peace. If Blair didn't find them, where are they?" Hamish picked up the ashtray and emptied the grey flakes into the heart of the fire, watching them vanish into the glowing embers. "The Highland soil is a very hungry thing, Priscilla. Sometimes it swallows things up and refuses to give them back. Those papers belong to a different time, a different set of ghosts. Bringing them into the light of a modern courtroom wouldn't have helped a soul. It would have just caused more pain for a village that's already had its fill of scandal. Mr. Johnson will pay for the life he took, but there's no need for the whole community to be poisoned by the ghost of a dead man's greed." Priscilla looked at him for a long, quiet moment, a softness in her blue eyes that always made Hamish's heart do a slow, painful somersault against his ribs. "You're a good man, Hamish Macbeth. A very strange, infuriatingly stubborn man, but a good one." She stood up, brushing a stray speck of soot from her sleeve, with a graceful flick of her wrist. "I should go. Father wants me to help him inventory the regimental silver again. He's convinced that in all the excitement, the police might have misplaced a commemorative quatch. Good luck with the colonel," Hamish said, walking her to the door. As she stepped out into the crisp morning air, she turned back and kissed him lightly on the cheek. It was a fleeting gesture, as brief as a break in the Highland clouds, but it left him standing in the doorway with a foolish grin long after her car had vanished around the bend toward the castle. He walked back to the stove and lifted the lid of the poaching tin. The salmon was perfect, the pink flesh flaking away in delicate, moist layers. He served himself a generous portion and sat down, sharing a small choice piece with Lugs, who accepted the tribute with a single dignified gulp. Outside, the loch had returned to its state of ancient, brooding tranquility, the water as still as a mirror. The mystery of the smuggler was over. The outsider's noise had been silenced, the secrets were ashes, and the lazy constable was exactly where he belonged. Hamish took a sip of his hot coffee, felt the warmth of the stove seep into his bones, and let out a long sigh of contentment. In Lochdubh, a quiet afternoon was the greatest prize of all, and he intended to enjoy every single second of it.